If you ever find yourself driving alone on the back roads of Vermont in late October, you'll understand why Charlotte Evans kept her headlights on high even in the pouring rain. The storm that night was relentless. Sheets of rain hammered the windshield. Thunder cracked so close it rattled the dashboard, and gusts of wind threatened to push her aging Subaru off the narrow road altogether. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, mind drifting to memories she tried to forget, of a happier time before the world became so small and silent. Charlotte was 56, and though not old by any stretch, she felt every one of those years as she drove through the darkness. The loneliness that clung to her since her husband passed away seemed to echo with every beat of the wipers. She had spent most of her adult life teaching third graders how to read and do long division, how to be kind to each other, how to face the world with courage. Yet now, facing her own empty farmhouse at the end of each day, she found the courage harder to come by. Lightning flashed, illuminating a world of wet leaves and broken branches, and as she rounded a sharp bend, Charlotte's heart jolted. Something huge and dark sprawled across the road ahead. At first glance, just a tangle of limbs and mud. Instinct screamed at her to hit the brakes and swerve, and she did, the car skidding, tires shrieking against the slick pavement. For a split second, Charlotte thought she might go off the road, but the car jerked to a stop mere feet from the unmoving mass. She sat there, breath caught in her throat, listening to the engine idle and the storm batter the roof. For a moment she told herself it was just a fallen tree or a deer, but the longer she stared, the more certain she became that this was no wild animal. It was a horse, a big one, chestnut brown and soaked to the bone, lying in a puddle. Legs twisted beneath him as if he'd simply collapsed mid-gallop. Charlotte's first impulse was fear. Horses had always unsettled her, their size, their unpredictable movements. As a girl, she'd once been bitten at a petting zoo, and ever since she kept her distance. Now, staring at the animal blocking her way home, her heart pounded so loud she wondered if the horse could hear it. But then the creature's head lifted, just barely, and Charlotte saw the wild whites of his eyes. The way his sides heaved as he struggled for breath. Something shifted in her chest. Without another thought, she fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, voice shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. No service. Of course, out here, the hills swallowed cell signals. Panic fluttered up inside her, cold and sharp, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd told frightened children to just breathe, count to 5. The horse was suffering, and there was no one else for miles. She glanced at the battered umbrella in her passenger seat, the heavy coat on the back seat. She remembered her husband's voice. "You can do this, Charlie." So clear it made her eyes sting. She pushed open the car door and stepped into the storm. Rain lashed her face, instantly soaking her hair and jeans, but she kept moving, boots squelching through the mud until she was standing just a few feet from the animal. Up close, the horse seemed even bigger, his body trembling so hard she thought he might shatter. He smelled of wet earth, sweat, and fear. "Easy, easy now," Charlotte whispered, her voice shaky but gentle. The horse's ears flicked toward her, and he let out a soft, desperate snort. She knelt beside him, careful to keep her movements slow, and draped her thick coat over his trembling back. The fabric was no match for the cold, but it was all she could offer. Charlotte reached out a tentative hand, brushing the horse's sodden neck, feeling the warmth beneath the wet hair, the frantic pulse just under the skin. She remembered something from years ago, a lesson about shock and body heat, and hoped it still mattered. The rain grew heavier. Thunder rolled over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, a tree branch snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Charlotte flinched, then forced herself to focus. She tried her phone again, still nothing. Her car's hazard lights blinked red in the dark, but no other headlights appeared. It was just her and the horse and the wild, merciless night. Minutes stretched on. The horse's breaths grew shallower. Desperate, Charlotte searched her memory for anything useful. She rummaged through her car and found an old granola bar and a handful of sugar cubes she kept for tea. Kneeling by his head, she broke the sugar into tiny pieces, offering them in her palm. The horse's muzzle was warm and surprisingly soft as he nibbled the sugar, his eyes never leaving hers. Charlotte kept talking, her voice steady despite the fear, telling the horse he'd be all right, telling herself the same thing. She tried to recall every first aid trick she'd ever taught, searching for signs of injury, feeling for heat or swelling, watching for blood. Still, no cars, no help. She screamed into the storm, waving her arms, hoping someone, anyone, might hear. Her voice was swallowed by thunder. Then, as she cradled the horse's massive head in her lap, Charlotte realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about her own loneliness or grief. She was simply present, desperate to save a life. The storm raged on, but inside Charlotte something quietly shifted, a fierce, stubborn resolve she thought she'd lost. And as the minutes crawled by and the rain poured down, Charlotte Evans, former schoolteacher, widow, and reluctant recluse, discovered that on a night when the world had closed in, compassion could pry it wide open. Charlotte's soaked jeans clung to her legs as she knelt in the mud beside the trembling horse, her coat already soaked through, offering little warmth for either of them. Each shudder of the animal made her stomach knot tighter. She pressed her palm to his damp neck, feeling the faint flutter of his pulse, so delicate it was almost lost beneath her touch. The storm didn't let up. In fact, it seemed to howl louder, as if daring Charlotte to give up. But she wouldn't, couldn't. With a trembling hand, she wiped rain from her eyes, squinting down the dark road for any sign of headlights. Nothing. Just trees bending in the wind and the rhythmic flash of her car's hazards reflected on slick pavement. Charlotte remembered a lesson she'd taught years ago about what to do if someone, or something, went into shock. Keep them warm, speak gently, offer sugar if you could. She fumbled in her purse and found a battered tin of peppermints. With care, she broke a piece off and pressed it to the horse's lips. At first, he didn't respond, but then his tongue flicked out and accepted the treat, crunching weakly. "There you go," Charlotte murmured, her voice shaking as much from the cold as from fear. "It's going to be all right, big guy. I'm here, I promise." The horse's eyes blinked slowly, as if trying to believe her. She glanced at her phone, still no signal. Frustration flared in her chest. She needed help, real help, not just desperate gestures in the dark. She stood and shouted down the empty road, cupping her hands around her mouth, ignoring the thunder as her voice cracked. Suddenly, the horse let out a groan, his body stiffening in a way that sent panic shooting through her. He thrashed once, and Charlotte instinctively jumped back, heart thudding in her ears. His eyes rolled, legs kicking at the air before falling still again. For a horrible moment, she thought he might die right in front of her. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees again, heedless of the mud. "No, no, stay with me," she pleaded, stroking his head. "You're not going anywhere tonight, you hear? Not if I have anything to say about it. Her voice cracked, almost breaking under the weight of fear. Desperately, Charlotte racked her brain for anything else she could do. She pulled off her own scarf and wrapped it around the horse's nose and face, hoping the extra warmth would help. She hummed softly, an old lullaby from her teaching days, the tune trembling in the storm. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. The horse's breathing slowed, the tension in his body easing a little. Charlotte exhaled, relief flooding her. She'd buy him a whole bag of sugar cubes if he made it through the night. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared down the road, a pair of headlights cutting through the rain, growing brighter as they neared. Charlotte sprang to her feet, waving her arms and yelling as loud as she could. The pickup truck slowed, then pulled over, tires crunching gravel and broken branches. A young couple emerged, umbrellas popping open. The man, a tall, wiry guy in his late 20s with a Red Sox cap, jogged over, followed by a woman in an oversized raincoat. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called out, voice barely audible over the rain. Charlotte could have cried with relief. "Please, help! He's hurt! I think he's dying!" She pointed to the horse, her voice cracking. The couple knelt beside her, assessing the situation with quick, capable movements. The man gently checked the horse's legs, running skilled hands along the joints. "He's alive, but he's in bad shape. We need to get him somewhere dry, fast," he said. The woman, her name was Trina, she introduced herself in a quick rush, pulled out her phone. "No service. We passed a vet clinic back in town. We can get him there if we work together." Her eyes met Charlotte's, full of determination. Together, the three of them sprang into action. The man backed his pickup closer, lowering the tailgate. It was a struggle. Lifting a half-conscious horse required all their strength and more ingenuity than Charlotte thought she had left. They fashioned a makeshift sling from the truck's old tarps and, using planks from the roadside, created a ramp. Trina gently coaxed the horse, whispering encouragement while Charlotte steadied his head, not letting go even when the animal's weight threatened to knock her down. Finally, with a combined heave, they managed to get the horse onto the bed of the truck, covering him with blankets and anything else they could find. Charlotte slid into the back with the horse, kneeling beside his head, while the couple climbed into the cab and cranked up the heat. The drive to the animal clinic was a blur of flashing lights, bouncing tires, and Charlotte praying under her breath. She stroked the horse's neck, whispering promises and half-remembered prayers. Every bump in the road made him groan, but he held on. When they reached the small animal hospital, the vet, a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back in a gray ponytail, rushed out with her team, surprised to see a horse, not a dog or cat. "Bring him inside, hurry!" she shouted, ushering them through the doors and into a warm, bright treatment bay. Charlotte stayed by the horse's side, refusing to leave even as the staff cut away his soaked blanket and began treating his injuries. She answered every question they asked, voice hoarse but steady. She promised, without hesitation, to cover any cost, to sign whatever paperwork was needed, to do anything at all if they could just save him. As dawn crept into the sky, Charlotte sat on a bench just outside the treatment room, exhausted but unable to sleep. Through the window, she could see the horse, now officially called Rusty by the vet, hooked up to IV fluids, his chest rising and falling in a slow, uncertain rhythm. Charlotte felt something shift deep inside. In the space of a single stormy night, she'd gone from a reclusive widow to a woman who'd carried a life in her hands and refused to let go. The storm had passed by the time Charlotte finally collapsed into the plastic chair in the small waiting room of the Green Mountain Animal Clinic. Her clothes still clung to her skin, icy and stiff from the night's ordeal, but she hardly noticed. A heavy silence had settled over everything, broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of the vet's team bustling behind closed doors. She stared at the coffee machine on the counter, thinking she should get up and make a cup, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Instead, she sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the door to the exam room where they were fighting for Rusty's life. She'd never thought much about fate, not since her husband passed. At first, she'd raged at the universe, demanding answers that never came, and then she'd learned to stop asking. But now, in the empty hours before dawn, she found herself whispering silent bargains to anyone or anything that might listen. The waiting was torture. Every minute felt like an hour. She replayed the night's events over and over, questioning her choices. Had she done enough? Was there something she missed? Could she have called for help sooner, or found a way to keep the horse warmer, or gotten him to the clinic faster? Guilt gnawed at her with every uncertain heartbeat. Time slowed and stretched, dragging her through memories she thought she'd buried. She saw her husband, Jim, in his favorite flannel shirt, grinning across their kitchen table. She heard his voice in the back of her mind. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Charlie." She remembered how, after he died, she'd locked herself away from the world, turning down invitations, letting friendships fade. It was safer, she told herself, to avoid attachments, to keep her heart guarded. But sitting in that harshly lit waiting room, all Charlotte wanted was for someone to walk through the door and tell her everything would be all right. A nurse stepped out, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. "Ma'am, would you like a blanket or some coffee? It's going to be a while." Charlotte shook her head. "No, thank you. Please just keep me updated." The nurse offered a small, sympathetic smile before disappearing back inside. Charlotte pulled her knees to her chest and hugged them, trying to hold herself together. She glanced at her phone, now working again, but ignored the stack of unread messages and missed calls from concerned neighbors. She couldn't face the outside world just yet. As the sky outside began to lighten, Charlotte drifted into uneasy memories, days spent at her husband's bedside, watching him slip further away, powerless to save him. She remembered the hollow ache of coming home to an empty house, the echo of silence in rooms that used to be filled with laughter and warmth. She'd thought she was done with hope, done risking herself for something fragile. But Rusty's wide, desperate eyes had stirred something in her she'd thought was long dead. A stubborn flicker of faith, a willingness to fight for another living being. The minutes ticked by, and Charlotte found herself recalling moments from her teaching days. Little hands clutching hers after playground scrapes. The way frightened children calmed when she sang softly to them. The pride she felt watching her students find their courage. She wondered when she'd lost her own. Eventually, the vet, a sturdy woman named Dr. Hartley, with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to her elbows, came out, wiping her hands on a towel. Charlotte shot to her feet so quickly her legs nearly gave out. "He made it through the night," Dr. Hartley said, her voice both reassuring and grave. "It's touch and go, but he's a fighter. We've given him fluids, pain meds, and he's resting now. You can see him if you like, but he'll need intensive care for the next few days, maybe longer." Relief crashed over Charlotte in a wave so powerful she almost sobbed. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she said, gripping Dr. Hartley's hand with both of hers. She followed the vet down the hall, nerves jangling. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and hay, a mixture that somehow reminded Charlotte of the old country fairs she and Jim used to visit. When she saw Rusty, her heart clenched. He looked so small now, despite his size, shivering under thick blankets, an IV snaking from his neck, eyes half-lidded but aware. Charlotte knelt by his side. She stroked his face and whispered, "You're safe now. I'm not going anywhere. Not as long as you need me." Rusty's ears twitched, and he let out a slow, raspy sigh. For the first time in years, Charlotte let herself believe in something good. Dr. Hartley explained what needed to happen next. Round-the-clock monitoring, special feeds, more tests. "Do you have anyone you can call for help with costs?" she asked gently. Charlotte surprised herself by answering without hesitation, "I'll cover it, whatever it takes." The words felt right, even if she wasn't sure how she'd manage it. Something about this horse, his brokenness, his will to survive, mirrored her own. She would not turn away. All that day and into the next night, Charlotte remained at the clinic. She barely slept, instead sitting beside Rusty, humming soft tunes and reading aloud from the old paperbacks the nurse brought her. Every hour she checked on him, counting the rise and fall of his chest, holding his mane when he thrashed in fevered dreams. In the quiet moments, she reflected on fate and the strange ways kindness bound people and animals together. She felt the weight of her own isolation and the odd hope that maybe this horse was the sign she'd been waiting for. A second chance. A way to step back into the world she'd shut out. As dusk fell, Charlotte looked at Rusty, his breathing stronger now, and whispered, "Maybe we're both getting a new start." In that moment, the walls she'd built around her heart began to crack, letting in the smallest flicker of light. Charlotte's days and nights at the Green Mountain Animal Clinic soon blurred into a quiet routine, one defined by the soft whir of medical machines, the scent of antiseptic, and the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of Rusty's breathing. Each morning, she woke in the stiff-backed visitor's chair to find the horse's big brown eyes watching her, as if assuring her that he was still fighting. By the end of the week, Rusty's condition had stabilized. Dr. Hartley beamed with cautious pride as she declared, "He's stubborn, I'll give him that, Tim. He's got a shot." The news rippled through Charlotte, relief and something like joy bubbling up inside. She took to brushing Rusty's mane, humming old songs from her teaching days, sharing quiet words and stories she'd never told anyone else. To her surprise, the big chestnut gelding listened, really listened, his ears flicking with interest as she recounted the small heartbreaks and forgotten joys of a life lived mostly in the background. One morning, as she cleaned Rusty's coat, her fingers brushed across a patch of faded, scarred skin on his left flank. At first, she thought it was an old injury, but as she peered closer, she saw the faint outline of something more deliberate, a brand. The symbol was nearly invisible, the hair grown back pale and patchy over the years, but Charlotte could just make out the letters WCR inside a crescent moon. Curiosity flared in her chest. Brands were a relic of another world, one she'd only glimpsed on documentaries and in the stories Jim used to tell about Texas ranchers. Something about the mark called to her, a mystery waiting to be solved. She snapped a photo with her phone and showed it to Dr. Hartley, who shrugged. "Looks like an old ranch brand to me. You should talk to one of the large animal vets in the area. They might know more." The idea wouldn't let Charlotte go. That evening, as rain drummed against the clinic's windows, She found herself Googling everything she could about horse brands, Vermont equine registries, and old ranches. Hours passed, her coffee cooling beside her, as she tumbled deeper into the digital rabbit hole. Most leads turned up dead ends, outdated phone numbers, shuttered websites, and archived newspaper clippings that led nowhere. But late that night, she stumbled onto a reference in a dusty online forum, a discussion among horse enthusiasts about a once-famous Texas property called Willow Creek Ranch. The ranch, it seemed, had been renowned decades ago for breeding championship quarter horses. Its brand? A crescent moon and the initials WCR. The posts hinted at a family tragedy and the ranch's subsequent abandonment, but details were scarce. Charlotte's heart beat faster as she dug deeper, piecing together fragments of a story. The Johnson family, a prize-winning gelding that vanished one stormy night, and rumors that a beloved horse named Rusty had simply disappeared. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Could her Rusty be the same horse? Emboldened by the possibility, Charlotte reached out to the forum, posting a photo of Rusty's brand and asking for any leads. She sent emails to local Vermont historians, Texas ranching associations, and even an equine genealogist she found through a blog. Most replies were polite but unhelpful, wishing her luck, but offering no real answers. Days passed, each one a lesson in patience and persistence. Charlotte spent her time by Rusty's side, reading him snippets of emails, joking that maybe he was famous and just hadn't told her yet. She couldn't explain it, but the mystery gave her purpose, a thread that connected her to something bigger than herself. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the clinic's high windows, her phone buzzed with an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was thin but clear, carrying the slow drawl of someone who'd spent a lifetime under wide southern skies. "My name's Bill Johnson," the man said, after Charlotte introduced herself. "You said you found a horse with the Willow Creek brand up in Vermont?" Charlotte's breath caught. "Yes, sir. He's here with me now. I think he might be your Rusty." There was a long pause on the other end. Charlotte could almost picture the old man sitting at a cluttered kitchen table, wrestling with hope and disbelief. Finally, he spoke, his words trembling. "We lost Rusty near on 15 years ago. There was a flood. The barn doors gave out. And by the time we got things under control, he was gone. We searched for weeks. I never stopped looking, not really." Charlotte listened as Mr. Johnson described the ranch's decline after the accident, how tragedy and loss had pushed the family apart, leaving him the last of the old guard, living alone in a house haunted by memories and empty pastures. He asked Charlotte to describe the horse in detail: the faint star on his forehead, the notch in his left ear, his gentle eyes. With every detail, the conviction grew stronger. They were talking about the same animal. Tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes as she realized the scope of Rusty's journey and her own place in it. She promised Mr. Johnson she'd do everything possible to help the horse recover, and if he ever wanted to see him again, she'd find a way to make it happen. That evening, as she sat with Rusty, Charlotte told him everything she'd learned. "You're a legend, you know that? You didn't just wander into my life. You've been on a journey, too, running from one storm to another, and somehow we both ended up here." For the first time in years, Charlotte felt a sense of purpose, a calling she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just saving a horse. She was helping heal an old wound, piecing together the threads of a story that had unraveled long before she ever entered the picture. She decided that night, when Rusty was strong enough, she would take him home to Texas, back to the ranch that never stopped waiting for him. And as she drifted to sleep in the quiet of the clinic, Charlotte realized she was no longer just passing time. She was answering a call, reaching out across miles and years to bring something lost back to where it belonged. Charlotte stood beneath the wide, cloudy Vermont sky, feeling the tremble of anticipation run through her as she checked the last bungee cord on Rusty's travel pen. The past weeks at the animal clinic had been a blur of small victories and anxious setbacks. Days when Rusty ate with enthusiasm, followed by nights when his fever spiked, or he stood listless and trembling. But Dr. Hartley finally declared him fit for travel, and Charlotte had wasted no time. She promised Mr. Johnson that Rusty would come home, and now, for the first time in years, she herself felt like she was going somewhere, really going somewhere, with purpose. Her Subaru groaned beneath the weight of supplies: hay bales, water jugs, vet wraps, a first aid kit, a stack of mystery novels for herself, and a faded photograph of Jim tucked into the visor. She tried to ignore the doubt gnawing at her. Driving halfway across the country with an aging horse and no real plan might seem crazy to anyone else. But as she looked at Rusty, who waited patiently in the trailer, head poking through the open window, she felt only determination. The first leg of their trip was easy enough. Vermont's green hills giving way to the patchwork fields of New York, and then to the flat, open highways of Pennsylvania. Charlotte sang along to old country ballads, sometimes talking out loud to Rusty, updating him on the scenery or the weather, half out of habit and half to keep her own nerves at bay. She stopped frequently, checking on him at every rest area. He responded to her voice now, lifting his head when she called, nudging her pocket for a treat, and even whinnying softly when she took too long. But by the third day, the road began to wear on both of them. In the middle of Ohio, under a bruised and churning sky, the Subaru sputtered and coughed before grinding to a halt just outside a tiny, nearly forgotten town. Charlotte managed to steer the car off the road, heart hammering as trucks whizzed by. The engine refused to turn over, no matter how many times she begged or tried. For a long moment, she just sat behind the wheel, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, rain streaking the glass. She could feel panic rising, the old fear of being stranded, of having no one to call. But as she stepped out into the drizzle, she caught sight of Rusty's calm, steady eyes watching her from the trailer. He blinked, unconcerned by the delay, as if to say, "We're together. We'll manage." Charlotte called for a tow truck, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. "Yes, I have a horse with me. Yes, we're headed to Texas. No, I don't have anyone else to help." The dispatcher sounded dubious, but promised to send someone soon. While she waited, she dug out an old rain poncho, wrapped herself up, and sat with Rusty, sharing an apple and humming under her breath to calm her nerves. An hour later, a battered red tow truck arrived, driven by a woman named Gloria with a quick smile and strong arms. She took one look at Charlotte, then at the horse, and said, "Well, aren't you two a sight? Don't worry, honey, we'll get you fixed up." They towed the Subaru to a tiny local garage. The mechanic, an old man with grease-stained overalls, worked through the evening, letting Charlotte and Rusty rest in the shade of the shop's carport. Gloria shared stories of her own animals, and before long, Charlotte found herself laughing for the first time in weeks. When the car was finally ready, Gloria pressed a bag of homemade cookies into Charlotte's hands and gave Rusty a gentle pat. "You take care of each other now," she said. Charlotte promised she would. They pushed south again, the miles rolling by. Charlotte learned to read Rusty's moods. When he seemed anxious or restless, she'd pull over and let him graze in a safe spot, or she'd simply sit by his side, letting the wind tangle her hair and the sun warm her face. She found herself opening up to strangers at truck stops and roadside diners. When people asked about the horse, she told the story, how she'd found him on a stormy night, how he was heading home after years lost, how she was just the lucky soul who'd stumbled into his path. The reactions surprised her. Some folks offered to buy them lunch or donate a few dollars for gas. Others simply wished them luck, sharing their own stories of animals that changed their lives. Each conversation stitched Charlotte a little closer to the world, made her feel less like a ghost haunting the edges of life. But their luck was tested again as they crossed into Oklahoma. A violent summer thunderstorm swept in fast, lightning splitting the sky, winds buffeting the trailer so hard Charlotte could barely keep the Subaru on the road. Forced to pull into a muddy field, she watched helplessly as water pooled around the tires and the wind howled through the trees. Rusty pawed the floor of the trailer, eyes wide with fear. Charlotte acted quickly. She climbed into the trailer talking to Rusty, stroking his neck, trying to calm him even as her own heart thudded with anxiety. The thunder was deafening, and the trailer shook, but she stayed by his side, humming old lullabies. When the worst of the storm passed, she set up camp in the back seat of her Subaru, listening to the rain drumming above as Rusty settled at last, his breathing deep and even. By sunrise, the storm had moved on. Mud clung to Charlotte's boots and her jeans, but she didn't care. She cleaned Rusty's legs, checked his hooves, made sure he'd weathered the night. He nuzzled her hair, and for a moment, Charlotte felt a surge of something fierce and bright. Love, loyalty, gratitude. As they crossed into Texas, a strange peace settled over her. She and Rusty had survived breakdowns, storms, and long, lonely miles together. The journey had forced Charlotte to rely on the kindness of strangers and the strength she'd forgotten she had. Each mile brought them closer to Willow Creek Ranch, but it was the bond they'd forged on the road, the quiet trust, the shared determination that changed her most. And as the Texas sun rose ahead, lighting their way, Charlotte whispered to Rusty, "Almost home, partner. Almost home." The Texas sky stretched endlessly above as Charlotte's battered Subaru and the horse trailer rolled down the cracked rural highway, heat rising in shimmering waves. Weeks on the road had left her sunburned, road-weary, and strangely lighter, as if every obstacle shed another old layer of sorrow. When she saw the faded sign, Willow Creek Ranch, half hidden by overgrown wildflowers, Charlotte's heart pounded like a drum. She slowed the car, rolling to a stop at the gate. The ranch beyond was nothing like the lively photographs she'd seen online. The house, once white, was weathered gray. Windows blinked behind grime and wind-blown leaves. Fences leaned, their paint peeling, and a tangle of weeds had overtaken the pastures. In the distance, a few cows grazed lazily, and the old barn slumped like a man who'd carried too much weight for too long. Everything looked tired, but not unloved. Charlotte swallowed hard and opened the car door. The heat hit her like a wall. Rusty, sensing something different, whinnied softly in the trailer, pawing the floor. She whispered reassurance, then walked to the porch and knocked. For a long moment, only the cicadas replied. Finally, the door creaked open. An elderly man stood there, tall but stooped, silver hair sticking out in every direction. His face was sun-browned and deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp, flickering with the remnants of pride and years of disappointment. "You must be Charlotte," he said, voice rough as gravel but not unkind. "And you've got my horse, I hear." Charlotte managed a smile, nerves jangling. "Mr. Johnson? I'm so grateful you answered my call. Rusty's outside. He's here to come home." He stared at her for a long, appraising moment, and she wondered if he might turn her away after all this way. Instead, he stepped aside. "Let's see him then." Together, they walked to the trailer. When Rusty stepped out, his head high but movements careful, Mr. Johnson stopped in his tracks. The old man's breath hitched, hands trembling as he reached for the horse's muzzle. Rusty nudged his chest and snorted softly, as if recognizing an old friend. "Well, I'll be—" Mr. Johnson choked on the words, blinking rapidly. "You made it home, old fella. You made it." He scratched Rusty's jaw, running his fingers over the faded crescent moon brand, tears slipping silently down his weathered cheeks. Charlotte watched, heart aching. The ranch, the man, the horse, they were all survivors of loss, haunted by the same ghosts. "Place ain't what it used to be," Mr. Johnson finally admitted, his voice softer. "I'm not what I used to be either. After my wife passed and the family left, it just got harder to keep up with everything. The land, it remembers. Sometimes I think it mourns with me." Charlotte listened, understanding more than she could say. She told him the story of finding Rusty on that rain-soaked Vermont road, the fear, the hope, the desperate fight through the night. She explained how she'd uncovered the brand, tracked down the ranch's history, and felt compelled to help Rusty find his way back. Mr. Johnson nodded as she spoke, as if each word untied a knot in his chest. "I always wondered if he made it out alive. Every storm, I'd listen for him, hoping to hear him calling. I reckon you saved us both, Charlotte." They led Rusty toward the barn, which leaned dangerously to one side, its red paint faded to pink. Inside, the smell of dust and hay brought back flashes of Charlotte's childhood. County fairs, pony rides, laughter. But the barn was in bad shape. A hole in the roof, loose boards, rusted tools scattered on the floor. "He can't stay in here like this," Charlotte said, her schoolteacher's resolve rising. "Let's fix it up, together, Mr. Johnson looked at her with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Don't get many visitors who want to work, but all right, let's see what we can do." The two spent the afternoon hauling boards, hammering nails, and scrubbing away years of grime. Charlotte sweated through her shirt, muscles burning, but she felt alive. Every swing of the hammer, every laugh shared over stubborn nails, stitched her more firmly into the fabric of the ranch. Rusty watched from a patch of shade, occasionally wandering over to supervise. As the sun dipped low, casting the barn in a golden glow, he stepped through the open door and paused, ears pricked. He sniffed the air, then made a slow circle of the stalls, finally stopping in a corner where the floor was still swept clean. Mr. Johnson stood frozen, watching Rusty paw at the old straw and drop his great head in contentment. "He remembers," Mr. Johnson whispered, voice breaking. "This was his stall. My wife used to keep apples here, just for him." Charlotte blinked back tears, watching as Rusty settled, breathing in the scent of home. For the first time since she arrived, the ranch felt less haunted, less a place of loss, and more a place where something could begin again. That night, as dusk wrapped the fields in purple light, Charlotte and Mr. Johnson sat on the porch, drinking sweet tea and listening to Rusty's quiet nickers from the barn. The air buzzed with crickets, the kind of Texas summer music you can feel in your bones. "Thank you, Charlotte," Mr. Johnson said at last, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You didn't just bring home my horse. You brought back hope. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm grateful all the same." Charlotte smiled, feeling the last pieces of her old life shift into something new. "We all deserve a second chance," she said, "even if it comes from a storm, or a stranger, or an old horse who wouldn't quit." As the sky darkened and a soft wind rustled the fields, Charlotte realized she was exactly where she needed to be, right at the heart of someone else's healing and her own. By the end of Charlotte's first week at Willow Creek Ranch, word had spread through the small Texas town. Rusty was home. Folks who remembered the ranch in its glory days drove by slowly, craning their necks to see the chestnut gelding who had once been the pride of county fairs. Some stopped at the gate, bearing fresh apples or sacks of feed, offering congratulations and stories. Mr. Johnson, who hadn't hosted a visitor in years, seemed both delighted and bewildered by the sudden attention. He introduced Charlotte as the angel from Vermont every chance he got, and she was surprised at how quickly the townspeople embraced her. Yet, beneath the surface, Charlotte could sense unease. Not everyone was happy about Rusty's return or the new energy on the old ranch. One afternoon, as Charlotte repaired fence rails with Mr. Johnson, a shiny black pickup truck pulled up, scattering gravel in its wake. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in mirrored sunglasses, climbed out and surveyed the land with a practiced eye. "Well, look who finally showed back up," he called, a smirk curling his lips. "I see the lost horse wandered home. Must be a miracle, huh, Earl?" Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened. "Afternoon, Frank. Didn't expect to see you out this way." Charlotte wiped her brow and glanced between them. Frank Harper, she learned, was a neighboring rancher who had, years ago, tried to buy Willow Creek after the Johnson family tragedy. He was known for his sharp business sense and his willingness to exploit a bad situation if it meant expanding his land. Now, with Rusty home and people talking about Willow Creek again, Frank's interest was plainly rekindled. Frank leaned against the fence, sizing up Charlotte. "So, you're the one who brought the old gelding back. I hope you got paperwork on that horse. Wouldn't want any confusion about ownership. Lots of folks around here remember when this ranch was up for sale, and that horse was part of the assets, as I recall." Charlotte's heartbeat stuttered. "I found Rusty in Vermont, half dead in the road. I spent weeks nursing him back to health. Mr. Johnson's name is on the old records. There's no confusion about who he belongs to." Frank shrugged, but his gaze was steely. "Paperwork can get lost. Claims can get messy. I'd hate to see an outsider like you get caught up in legal trouble. Just a friendly warning." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, cane in hand. "That horse is mine, Frank. He always was. You'll have to go through me." Frank smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He tipped his hat and climbed back into his truck. "We'll see how things shake out," he called as he sped away. The encounter left Charlotte rattled. She knew people like Frank, men who saw compassion as a weakness, who mistook kindness for ignorance. But she also knew how fiercely she could fight when something mattered. Later that evening, she made photocopies of every document she and Mr. Johnson could find. Old registration papers, veterinary receipts, even faded ribbons from county fairs. She stored them in a locked tin, just in case. Despite the tension, the work at Willow Creek continued. The barn, now patched and weatherproofed, housed not just Rusty, but a pair of stray goats who'd wandered over from the neighbor's pasture. Mr. Johnson joked that soon they'd be running a full-blown animal rescue. Each morning, Charlotte found herself looking forward to the rituals of farm life, hauling feed, mucking stalls, walking the fence lines with Rusty at her side. For the first time since Jim died, she felt a sense of homecoming. But nature had other plans for the newfound peace. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Charlotte noticed the creek that gave the ranch its name was rising, churning with muddy water. By dusk, the rain came in sheets, pounding the roof, turning the pastures into a river of slick red clay. Mr. Johnson paced the porch, worry etched on his face. "I haven't seen it this bad since the year we lost Rusty," he muttered. When thunder cracked, loud as gunfire, Rusty bolted in his stall, whinnying in terror. The goats bleated. Water began to seep into the barn. Charlotte and Mr. Johnson rushed outside, boots sinking in mud, flashlights bobbing as they shouted to each other over the roar of wind and rain. "The animals! We've got to get them to higher ground!" Charlotte yelled, grabbing a lead rope. The creek was out of its banks now, swirling past the fence. Mr. Johnson's cane slipped on the porch, but he steadied himself, stubbornly refusing to stay behind. Rusty's eyes rolled white in panic, but Charlotte moved with calm determination. She led him out into the storm, her arms slick with rain, talking softly. "It's all right, boy, I've got you," even as fear knotted her gut. Mr. Johnson herded the goats, wading through knee-deep water. Suddenly, a loose fence board crashed into Charlotte's leg, nearly knocking her down. She bit back a cry, clutching the rope tighter. Rusty planted his hooves and, as if understanding the urgency, pulled her toward the hill behind the barn. The goats followed, struggling but determined. Mr. Johnson limped after them, breath coming in ragged bursts. Lightning flashed, revealing the ranch's outbuildings half submerged. Charlotte urged the animals up the hill, not stopping until they reached a grove of ancient oaks, their roots anchoring the soil against the flood. She tied Rusty to a sturdy branch, then helped Mr. Johnson collapse onto a fallen log. They huddled beneath the trees as rain lashed down. Rusty pressed close to Charlotte, his warmth a comfort against the cold. Mr. Johnson wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You saved them, Charlotte. You saved all of us." As dawn broke, the storm passed. The ranch was battered but standing. The barn, though muddy, still held together, and the animals were safe. Word spread through town how Rusty, the prodigal gelding, had led the others to safety, how Charlotte and Mr. Johnson had risked their lives to save the herd. For the first time, Rusty was seen not just as a relic of the past, but as a hero. But Charlotte knew the real test was yet to come. Frank Harper's threats lingered in her mind, a shadow over their fragile new peace. Still, as she watched Rusty graze in the golden light, surrounded by the people and animals who had come to depend on her, Charlotte felt a resolve stronger than any fear. They had weathered one storm. She was ready for whatever would come next. The storm left Willow Creek Ranch bruised and battered, but alive. For Charlotte and Mr. Johnson, cleaning up the mud and debris was easier than dealing with what came next. The morning after the flood, a certified letter arrived, official, cold, and devastating in its simplicity. Frank Harper, never one to bluff, had filed a claim on Rusty, attaching photocopies of ancient bills of sale and court-stamped documents. He insisted, proved ownership. Mr. Johnson stood on the porch, hands trembling as he read the letter aloud. "He's got no heart," he muttered, slamming the paper down on the kitchen table. "Not a bit of decency." Charlotte's chest tightened. She knew that, for Frank, it wasn't about Rusty at all. It was about land, about pride, about proving he could take what he wanted. And if he won, everything they'd rebuilt, hope, trust, the fragile new sense of community, could be snatched away in an instant. She sat at the table, heart pounding. "We're not letting him win," she said, voice low but fierce. "Rusty is yours, and this ranch is yours. We're going to fight this, I promise." Mr. Johnson looked at her, eyes hollow with worry, but alive with a glimmer of old fire. "I never had much taste for legal fights, Charlotte. Never saw much good come of 'em." Charlotte squeezed his hand. "Maybe that's why you need me. I've dealt with plenty of bullies, kids, parents, even a few school board members. And I know that the only way to stop a bully is to stand together." Her words set something in motion. They spread the word, first to the folks who'd come with apples and feed, then to neighbors who'd grown up hearing stories of Rusty and the Johnson family, and finally to townspeople who'd never set foot on Willow Creek, but still remembered its heyday. Charlotte organized a meeting at the community center, urging anyone who cared about the ranch, the horse, or fairness to come out and show support. The night of the meeting, the hall buzzed with tension. Frank Harper arrived early, legal documents in hand, flanked by his lawyer, a woman with sharp glasses and a sharper tongue. Charlotte wore her best dress, hair pulled back tight, notes trembling in her palm. Mr. Johnson stood by her side, pressed and proud in his old Stetson. As the meeting began, Frank stood and outlined his claim. He spoke with practiced authority, waving his documents for all to see, his words echoing off the walls. "The law is the law. That horse was included in the assets when the Johnson family tried to sell. I have the paperwork. I have every right." Charlotte's stomach clenched. She looked at the rows of faces, old farmers, young mothers, teenage ranch hands, waiting for her to speak. She rose, steadying herself, her teacher's voice cutting clear and true through the anxious murmurs. "Frank Harper may have paperwork, but I have the truth. I found Rusty abandoned and dying on a Vermont road. I paid for his recovery. Mr. Johnson has loved and cared for him his entire life. What kind of place do we want this town to be? A place where bullies win by twisting the law? Or a place where community, history, and compassion matter?" There was a rumble of support, people nodding, voices rising. Mr. Johnson spoke next, voice gravelly with emotion. "I know some of you think I gave up on this place. But I never gave up on Rusty. This ranch, it's not just land, it's home. That horse is family." One by one, townspeople stood to add their voices. Gloria from the tow shop, who'd driven all the way from Oklahoma with her wife, told how Charlotte had never given up, on Rusty or on anyone. An elderly woman recounted how Rusty had pulled her out of a ditch during the last big storm, refusing to leave her side until help arrived. Even kids who'd come to feed the goats spoke up, describing how much the ranch and its animals had come to mean. Frank's lawyer pushed back, waving her legal papers. "With respect, the law doesn't care about feelings or stories." Charlotte looked straight at her. "Maybe not. But the people do. The law serves the community, not the other way around." After hours of heated debate, the town council called a vote. One by one, people stood to be counted. The results were clear. The community stood with Charlotte, Mr. Johnson, and Rusty. The council president, a stern woman with silver hair, looked Frank in the eye. "Your paperwork is old and questionable. Rusty's real home is here. The ranch stays with the Johnsons, and so does the horse." A cheer broke out. People hugged, some wept, and for the first time, Charlotte felt the full weight of what they'd accomplished. not just for Rusty, but for everyone who'd ever felt powerless or forgotten. Mr. Johnson pulled her into a rough, teary hug. "Thank you, Charlotte. You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not." Back at the ranch, they celebrated with pie and sweet tea under the stars. Rusty, oblivious to the human drama, munched apples from the hands of giggling children. The barn, still damp but sturdy, glowed with laughter and music. Charlotte looked around at the faces, strangers who had become friends, a man who had found hope again, a horse who had come home against all odds. She realized that, in standing up for Rusty, she had finally stood up for herself, for her own right to belong, to be brave, to start again. The fight was over. But the true reward was something deeper, a sense of belonging that would last far longer than any storm or legal threat. After the storm of conflict, a gentle peace settled over Willow Creek Ranch. The air felt clearer, the sky bluer, and the fields, still bearing scars from the flood, showed green shoots of new life. For the first time in years, laughter echoed across the property. Children's shouts mingling with the low nickers of horses and the steady, familiar creak of the barn doors. Charlotte threw herself into the rhythms of ranch life with an energy she hadn't felt since her teaching days. But now, her classroom stretched as far as the eye could see. Word of what she and Mr. Johnson had done, of Rusty's return, the flood, and the fight for the ranch, spread across the county. People came by, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes for advice, sometimes just to offer a helping hand or a slice of pie. One bright Saturday morning, Charlotte stood in the middle of the barn with a handful of eager children clustered around her, eyes wide with wonder. She'd organized an open barn day, determined to give something back to the community that had stood by her when she needed it most. Kids brushed Rusty's coat, giggling at the way he angled for sugar cubes, while Charlotte told the story of how a single act of kindness, just stopping for a stranded horse in the rain, had changed everything. She led the group in, caring for the animals, teaching them how to clean hooves, feed goats, and even patch a loose board. For many, it was their first time so close to a horse, and Charlotte watched as fear turned to delight, and shy hands reached out to touch Rusty's soft nose. Parents watched from the barn doors, snapping pictures, their faces lit with gratitude. "Why did you help him?" one small girl asked, eyes fixed on Rusty. "Weren't you scared?" Charlotte knelt beside her. "Yes, I was scared, but sometimes when you're scared, that's when you need to be kindest. Because you never know who else might be afraid or alone. And you never know how much difference you can make." The words felt true in her mouth. She realized how much she'd changed, how much she'd been changed by the simple, stubborn act of refusing to let Rusty die alone. The fear that had ruled her after Jim's death had given way to something else, a sense of purpose, of connection, of being part of a story that was bigger than her own sadness. Mr. Johnson found a new energy too. He fixed his old tractor and started a garden again, planting tomatoes and beans with help from some of the local teens. His laughter became a common sound around the ranch, especially when someone tried to argue with him about the best way to mend a fence or bake a peach cobbler. He showed off his collection of blue ribbons and faded photographs to anyone who asked, his pride no longer tinged with bitterness. Other animals arrived, rescued dogs, abandoned kittens, a duck with a limp that waddled up from the creek. Each one was welcomed and tended to, becoming part of the patchwork family forming at Willow Creek. The barn became a place of healing, not just for animals, but for people. Teenagers who'd struggled at school found confidence helping with chores. An elderly woman who'd lost her husband came by every Sunday to brush Rusty and talk about old times. Young couples brought their babies to meet the goats, planting roots of their own in the Texas soil. Charlotte started an after-school program, inviting local kids to learn about animal care, gardening, and the history of the ranch. Rusty became the centerpiece of every lesson, his gentle eyes and steady presence calming even the most anxious child. She watched shy children bloom, making friends and discovering talents they never knew they had. In helping Rusty heal, Charlotte saw the whole community begin to heal as well. As autumn colored the fields gold, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the months since that rainy night in Vermont. She thought about how she'd almost driven past Rusty. How easy it would have been to stay in her warm car and let someone else deal with the problem. She remembered the loneliness and the fear that had felt so permanent, and how quickly they'd begun to fade once she'd taken a risk for someone. Something besides herself. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped low and the ranch glowed in amber light, Charlotte sat on the porch with Mr. Johnson. Rusty grazed nearby, his coat gleaming, his head held high. Laughter drifted from the barn, where kids and parents cleaned up after another busy day. Mr. Johnson rocked back in his chair, looking at Charlotte with a quiet smile. "You know, I never thought I'd see this place come alive again. Never thought I'd feel useful, like I had something left to give." Charlotte smiled back, feeling warmth she hadn't known in years. "Me neither. I spent so long thinking my life was over, like everything worth having was behind me. Turns out there was a whole new chapter waiting. All it took was saying yes, even when I was scared." The porch light flickered on, moths swirling in its glow. Charlotte leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of children's laughter and Rusty's contented snort. She realized that by helping one lost horse, she had rewritten her own story. Not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts of kindness. And as the stars blinked awake over Willow Creek Ranch, Charlotte Evans knew she was home. Willow Creek Ranch was never just a piece of land, Charlotte realized, as the first frost of winter painted the fields silver. It was a crossroads, a place where stories intertwined, where a lonely widow from Vermont, a grieving old rancher, and a lost horse each found their way back to hope. It was a home for the lost and the brave, for anyone willing to reach across their own hurts and offer something of themselves to another. Months passed, and life at the ranch found its steady rhythm. The after-school programs Charlotte started became a fixture in the community. Children arrived in school buses or carpool vans, laughter and muddy boots tracking through the barn each afternoon. Under the gentle gaze of Rusty, now a local legend, they learned how to tend wounds, plant seeds, muck stalls, and listen, really listen, to one another. Charlotte watched them, sometimes from the porch, sometimes sitting cross-legged in the straw, telling stories or settling squabbles. She marveled at how these kids, many of them shy, some burdened by sadness or family troubles, opened up in the presence of animals. Rusty was their silent mentor, patient and calm. Even the most withdrawn child would eventually approach, coaxed by the warmth in his eyes and the way he seemed to listen without judgment. It wasn't just the children who were changed. The whole community took on new life. Young couples volunteered for weekend cleanups, planting wildflowers and mending fences. Retirees dropped off bags of feed or came by to help paint the faded barn doors. Teens who'd once only come for detention hours now returned willingly, even proud to be seen at Willow Creek. And always, at the center of it all, was Charlotte. No longer a visitor, but a leader, a mentor, a friend. Through it all, she never stopped feeling grateful. Grateful for the stormy night that set everything in motion. Grateful for the challenges, the moments she doubted herself. The unexpected friendships and setbacks. She came to see how every choice, each small act of kindness, every moment of courage or compassion, had ripple effects, shaping the lives of people she might never even meet. Late one evening, after the last of the children had gone home and the animals settled in their stalls, Charlotte took a walk through the pasture. The sky above her a deep velvet blue, scattered with stars. Rusty followed at her side, his breath fogging the air, his gait strong. She paused at the crest of a hill and looked back at the ranch. Warm light spilling from the kitchen windows, smoke curling from the chimney, laughter echoing faintly from inside. She thought about Jim, her late husband, and how for so long she'd kept herself locked away, afraid of losing again, afraid of being hurt. Now, standing in the quiet of the Texas night, she understood what he would have wanted for her. Not just survival, but the willingness to risk her heart again, to reach out, to love. Her journey with Rusty had started as an accident, a twist of fate on a rain-slicked road, but she saw now that it was never just about saving a horse. It was about learning to live again, to step into the unknown, to trust that compassion would lead her home. She remembered a lesson from her teaching days, that sometimes you saved a life simply by showing up, by refusing to look away. Sometimes that life was your own. As she walked back toward the house, she caught sight of Mr. Johnson sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood, his posture relaxed and content. The rancher's eyes found hers, and he tipped his hat, a silent thank you passing between them. Later that week, Charlotte was invited to speak at the local school assembly, a chance to share the story of Rusty and the ranch with an even wider audience. She stood before a room full of children, parents, teachers, her voice steady as she described what had happened that night in Vermont. The journey across the country, the battles they'd faced, and the unlikely friendships that had sprung up along the way. She finished with the words she hoped would linger in the hearts of everyone listening. You never know how far a small act of kindness will travel. You never know how many lives you might touch, just by stopping, by caring, by refusing to let someone face their storm alone. That's what makes a community. That's what gives us hope. Afterward, dozens of children surrounded her, peppering her with questions about Rusty, about the ranch, about bravery and fear. A little boy hugged her legs, whispering that he wanted to be kind like Charlotte when he grew up. A girl asked if she could visit the ranch and learn to ride. Those moments, Charlotte realized, were the real rewards. Not the victories in court, or even the return of Rusty, but the way kindness and courage multiplied, turning strangers into family and loneliness into belonging. As the seasons turned, Willow Creek Ranch blossomed. Fields once abandoned now bloomed with wildflowers. The barns rang with laughter, with the thud of boots, with the gentle whinny of horses. Mr. Johnson grew strong again, his joy unmistakable as he played checkers with teenagers and taught little ones how to plant beans. Rusty, always at the heart of it, grew even more gentle, a living reminder of all they had endured and all they had found. And Charlotte, once a reclusive widow haunted by grief, became the ranch's guiding spirit. She was a teacher again, not just of math or reading, but of hope, resilience, and the simple, world-changing power of compassion. One late afternoon, with the sun turning the fields to gold, Charlotte gathered everyone, children, parents, neighbors, on the lawn. She watched as Rusty trotted toward her, his coat shining, his eyes bright, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of a community that had found its way home. As the day faded into night and the first stars appeared, Charlotte whispered, "Thank you." Not just to Rusty, but to the universe, to every storm and every heartbreak that led her here. And Willow Creek Ranch stood as proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can echo far beyond what we ever imagine, changing not just one life, but many, and leaving a legacy of hope that lasts long after the last story is told.